The latest BBC News is next here on BBC One, followed by Panorama. Highlights on BBC Two of today's Newcastle United and Everton clash in Match of the Day 2. Comedy drama I'm Good Stupid is on BBC Three. And of course, BBC Four now is getting all loved up.
Don't let him in. Don't try to.
You give her back to me! You hurt her and I'll hunt you down.
She's sleeping now. Her eyes are closing.
EastEnders, all this week on BBC One.
They say he's a bit of a charmer.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I'd like to introduce some members of my group to you before we go any further. On backing vocals, the Sugar Babes. The man with the beautiful voice, Mr. Marvin Gaye. On the lead guitar is Jimmy Page. On the rhythm guitar, Noel Gallagher. And on the drums, Keith Moon. On bass guitar, Sheryl Crow. And finally on piano, the legendary Stevie Wonder. Play it, Stevie.
Now on BBC One, the news with Darren Jordan.
Tony Blair urges his party to focus on policies, not personalities. At the start of his last conference as leader, he refuses to endorse Gordon Brown as his successor.
I've said all I'm going to say on it, and the reason for that is very, very...
For this treatment in this instance.
But in Somerset, another patient, Barbara Clark, is getting her treatment funded. She's one of about 8 or 9 women who are getting the drug.
Now, the Health Secretary says she wants all women with early breast cancer to be given Herceptin if there's a clinical need. She doesn't want it refused on grounds of cost. But that's exactly what appears to be happening because health trusts haven't budgeted for this use of the drug. And it's not surprising because usually they'd wait till a drug was fully approved before they'd fund it.
But Elaine feels she can't wait. She's taking her case to the High Court.
It's just something I have to do. I'm not going to sit back, give up and be prepared to die early.
Elaine's also got the Health Secretary on her side. She'll be meeting with the Health Trust to review their decision. Jill Higgins, BBC News.
Officials throughout France have been given the power to declare a state of emergency to help end the rioting of the past fortnight. Local authorities can impose curfews, with police authorised to search suspects and raid premises without warrants. The powers come into force within the next hour. From Paris, Gavin Hewitt has the latest.
Tonight, outside the 3000 estate in Aulnay, they were drawing up police buses. For in 1 hour, local authorities here will be able to start using unprecedented emergency powers in areas where there have been nights of violence. Around troubled estates like this, police will now be able to set up roadblocks. They'll also be able to prevent the movement of certain people and vehicles, and they'll also be able to search properties here without a warrant. One town has already declared a limited curfew. No one under the age of 16 will be allowed on the streets between 10 o'clock at night and 6 in the morning. Many young people say a lockdown will only make the violence worse. We will feel locked in, said this young man, and it will continue to provoke everyone. Last night was much quieter in Paris, but still elsewhere in France, over 1,000 vehicles were set alight. In some areas, community patrols were trying to prevent the violence. Even so, more than 300 arrests were made. It means that courtrooms like this one in the Paris suburb of Bobigny are handling over 60 cases a day. This is fast-track justice. One young man here was accused of having traces of fuel on his hands. The evidence was discussed for just 15 minutes before he was sentenced to 4 months in prison. An indication today that the riots are causing political tension. In Parliament, an opposition MP said the government bore responsibility for the fire on the streets. His words were met with outrage. So, tough laws, never used before in mainland France, are now in place. What no one knows is whether they will deter or just provoke further violence. Gavin Hewitt, BBC News, Paris.
The President of China is at Buckingham Palace tonight, dining with the Queen at the start of his 3-day state visit to Britain. His arrival has provoked some protests about China's human rights record. At this evening's state banquet, the Queen spoke of China's rapid development and with it, the challenge of protecting the environment. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell reports.
They're the guests everyone wants to impress. Twice in 6 years, the Queen has invited a Chinese president for a full state visit and all the pageantry that goes with it. But there was gentle diplomacy as well as a state dinner at Buckingham Palace tonight. In his speech, President Hu said China stood ready to work for a more harmonious world and to create what he called more democracy at home. In her speech, the Queen too spoke of international cooperation and chose as her example of it the environment.
Now we are able to work together and in the international community to tackle problems of environmental protection and sustainable development.
On Horse Guards parade at lunchtime, the full ceremonial welcome of a state visit had been laid on. But Chinese state visits can cause complications. As Mr. Hu inspected the foot guards, protesters were gathering on the Mall. On the one side, supporters of the Chinese government. On the other, demonstrators who'd come to protest at China's annexation of Tibet.
What we want! Free Tibet!
6 years ago, when President Jiang Zemin of China paid his state visit, British police were notably intolerant of protesters. There was none of that today. Indeed, the only unusual sight was that of Chinese security men, on the left of the picture here, running alongside the Queen's carriage as it brought Mr. Hu up the Mall. Mr. Hu looked left as the protesters shouted from the right. And that was it. The honoured guest had made it to the palace without undue disturbance to a very important relationship. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, Buckingham Palace.
A man who stole the identity of a dead baby and used his name for over 20 years has been sent to prison by a judge at Canterbury Crown Court. The man, who calls himself Christopher Edward Buckingham, admitted lying to obtain a passport, and he's still not told police his real name, as Luisa Baldini reports.
He's been calling himself Christopher Edward Buckingham for the last 23 years, but that's not his real name. No one seems to know who he really is, not even his ex-wife Jodie or their 2 teenage children.
You're going over old memories, you're going through pictures, you're going through old documentation. It makes me feel incredibly stupid. Was I that blind? I've just sort of think, what could possess an individual to take on somebody's identity and live it for 23 years, duping your wife, you know, leaving sort of a huge void in your children's lives.
It was at Dover in January that the man was arrested after a routine check revealed that his passport had been fraudulently obtained. He claimed he was a lord and even had this headed notepaper, but that was a lie. In fact, he'd stolen the name Christopher Buckingham in 1983 from the birth certificate of an 8-month-old child. Baby Christopher had died 20 years earlier, and his mother Audrey is now traumatised by what's happened.
And I'd like to know why he did it. Why he chose my son's name. There's so much things I'd like to ask him.
The prosecution said that this fraud was a direct copy of the trickery used in Frederick Forsyth's novel The Day of the Jackal. In the book, the character takes the name of a dead child, buys his birth certificate and then applies for a passport. In this case, it happened for real. The police are pleased with the 21-month sentence, but admit they are still baffled.
I have no idea what it is he's got to hide and why he's taken this identity, but he's lived a life for 23 years and he's still living it.
Officers have now sent the man's fingerprints to Interpol, and they're hoping to get access to a safety deposit box in Zurich where he's been living, in the hope that it contains the secret of his identity. Louisa Baldini, BBC News.
And still to come on tonight's programme. How Uganda's success in the fight against AIDS could be undermined. The law which allows young girls to get confidential advice on abortion is being contested at the High Court. Sue Axon, a mother from Manchester, wants to ensure that parents are informed if daughters under the age of 16 are planning to have an abortion. Alison Holt reports.
Sue Axon arrived at the High Court today to argue that her right to care for her 13-year-old daughter is being undermined. Mrs. Axon had an abortion when she was younger, which she regrets. She wants to be told if her child ever seeks a termination.
If my daughter needs paracetamol, the school have to phone and ask for my permission. Not long ago she needed a plaster on a toe and the youth club phoned and asked for my permission. And I find the law absolutely crazy that she can have an abortion and I'm not even supposed to know about it.
In court, her lawyers insisted that parents should have the right to be told if a child asks for advice on contraception, sexual infections or an abortion. At the moment, doctors encourage them to tell parents, but have a duty of confidentiality to the child. It was Maureen Smith's experience which prompted this case. Her daughter now has a baby, but when she was 14, she had an abortion without her mum knowing.
I was absolutely appalled and shocked by it. I felt really insulted. I'm like, she's my child, she's 14.
But family planning experts fear without confidentiality, teenagers won't seek advice.
And they could therefore be at risk of unplanned pregnancy, sexually transmitted infections, and also there is a risk that abusive relationships could remain hidden.
At the heart of this case is the question, where do a parent's rights end and a child's begin? Getting that balance correct is vital at a time when the UK has a disturbingly high number of teenage pregnancies and soaring rates of sexually transmitted infections. The hearing is expected to last 3 days. Alison Holt, BBC News, the High Court.
Britain's biggest clothes retailer, Marks & Spencer, has produced further signs of a recovery in its fortunes. They've announced half-year profits of more than £300 million. That's a rise of 20% in a year. Rory Catlin-Jones reports.
In their new black uniforms, M&S staff at a London store hear an upbeat message. Their company's profits are up. They're winning more sales by getting new designs into stores more quickly. And George Davies has settled his row with Marks and agreed to stay on running the popular Peruna brand. The man who's led the revival says the recipe has been simple.
More newness, more excitement, better values. What you and I might say if we were being trite, shopkeeping, that's what we get paid to do, better shopkeeping.
So this company hasn't been doing the basic shopkeeping over the last 10 years?
It's fair to say, probably that's true.
It's only a few months back that Marks & Spencer was right out of fashion, not just with shoppers, but with shareholders. Now, after a relatively modest upswing in its fortunes, the mood has been completely transformed. Marks & Spencer shares spent years in the doldrums, but last summer they headed higher as the billionaire Philip Green threatened a takeover. After he was rebuffed, they stayed well below the £4 a share he'd promised, until September, when they began a rapid climb, closing today at £4.35.
Confidence from Rose as Marks & Spencer hits a 3-year high.
Alan and Hilda Perryman keep a close eye on every twist in the M&S tale. They're small shareholders who were firmly opposed to a takeover.
I was quite happy to hang on to them because I felt that the management was good, and I felt that the shares would recover, and indeed they did.
But this is a company which has promised better times before. Marks & Spencer has begun the job of making itself look a whole lot smarter, but it's still got to prove it's really back in fashion. Rory Catlin-Jones, BBC News.
The AIDS crisis continues to blight much of sub-Saharan Africa, but there is one country which has made impressive progress. A tough campaign saw levels of infection in Uganda fall from 15% in the early 1990s to just 4% by 2003. But that success could be undermined by a new campaign inspired by some American charities, which preaches abstinence instead of using condoms. From Kampala, Adam Minot sent this report.
HIV/AIDS stalks the streets of Uganda. It remains the country's biggest killer. In a strategy involving behavioural change and the use of condoms, HIV/AIDS infection here fell to around 4%. Uganda became a model for tackling HIV/AIDS. But now there's evidence that infection rates are climbing again. The HIV/AIDS strategy which has worked here is called ABC: abstinence, being faithful and condom use. But it's feared its success is now being undermined because the focus has shifted. Condoms are out. The message now is all about abstinence. The capital, Kampala, is plastered with billboards pushing sexual abstinence. Everywhere you look, there's another poster saying refrain from extramarital sex. A number of charities claim this campaign has been inspired by pressure from the United States. I met a leading activist.
Hello. Hi. Nice to meet you.
He told me it's driven by the AIDS funding program of George Bush.
President Bush decided to create a fund which is known as PEPFAR. Monies that are being sent now are mainly given to the faith-based organizations. And what we need to know is that the faith-based organizations will never support a condom.
When we teach these young people, we challenge them to make a commitment to abstinence from sexual activity until they're married.
The Family Life Network receives US money via a Christian organization. It takes its vehement opposition to condoms to schools across Uganda. The US anti-AIDS program gives money to groups opposed to sex outside marriage, part of a $100 million budget for fighting AIDS in Uganda. But the US ambassador told me it was nonsense to suggest that funding is mainly aimed at abstinence programs.
Those critics really are misinformed, and we've been very careful that we've been able to ramp up prevention in all areas. In Uganda, abstinence is an important part, especially for youth, but condoms have also been part of Uganda's program and our program for the last 15 years.
Gitta Margaret was diagnosed HIV positive 2 years ago. She visits the AIDS clinic 3 times a week to be checked. Gitta abstained from sex outside marriage and was faithful. But she contracted HIV from her husband, who has since died from an AIDS-related disease. Condoms would have prevented her infection. Campaigners argue that AIDS has such a grip on sub-Saharan Africa that only a comprehensive approach involving behaviour change and condom use can hope to control the spread of this killer disease. Adam Minot, BBC News, Uganda.
The new chip and PIN technology in credit cards is helping to cut down on fraud, according to the latest figures. But there's evidence that criminals are adapting to the changes using other fraudulent methods, online and by phone, as Hugh Pym reports.
Yeah, I'll take it.
Okay, yes, it's £1,500.
£1,500 for a camera. This retailer wants to be sure that the buyer is the real credit card owner. The chip and PIN system removes the need for signatures which can be forged.
Thank you. Thank you.
For face-to-face transactions in shops like this, chip and PIN has helped bring about a big reduction in card fraud. In the first 6 months of this year, it was nearly 30% lower than the same period the year before, at below £90 million. Criminals are transferring their efforts online. Internet and phone-related fraud was up nearly 30%, at more than £90 million. Dan Lyon has twice been a victim of online fraud. On one occasion, his credit card details were stolen by computer hackers in Russia.
It was someone in Russia having a bit of a shopping tour at my expense,
and they bought all sorts of goods to have delivered out to their home address, I guess. And yeah, there was quite a substantial number of transactions went through before we actually reported it to the credit card company.
Credit card companies have now added extra password protection for online shopping, another layer of defence against the fraudsters. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
We'll be back with the headlines in a few minutes, and on BBC News 24 tonight, dramatic rescue pictures as ferocious seas hit a yacht race in the Atlantic. But here on BBC One, it's time to join our news teams across the UK.